part of Kings that is pretty hard to keep track of what's going on. Kathy's coming around. If you put your hand up, she will bring you this timeline. I'll be honest with you, it's not the prettiest timeline that I have ever seen in my life, but it was free to reproduce. And so, you work with what you can. It gives you on the left-hand side the kings of Judah and the years that we understand them to have been reigning, and their name, and basically how they started and how they ended. It's a generalization if they did good and finished well, or if they were evil all the way through. That's a little bit of a subjective judgment, of course, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. And then, as you probably recall, the stories of the kings are found in 1st and 2nd Kings, but they're also found in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And so passages that are relevant for each king's reign are listed there. And again, it gets hard to keep track of this. And it gets really hard in the northern kingdom because there is not a steady line of kings. You remember one of the things that we saw early on was that God was going to be faithful to his promise to David that he would have a son who would be the ruler of his people. But right after Solomon, the kingdom splits. And the northern kingdom, those kings are not of the line of David, and they're not of any consistent line. You get a few kings in a row, and then things kind of fall apart. Jehu has a longer run than anybody else, but you don't have the same kind of consistency. So again, especially as we get into these shorter descriptions of the kings, it gets harder and harder to keep track of them. Unfortunately, there are some kings that have the same name in the northern and southern kingdom, and that gets hard. There are also variant spellings of the names. Even as you read through, I'll try and point those out when we get there. So it gets a little tricky. And I found this to be a helpful little chart to just have next to my Bible as I read through, and I hope it'll be the same for you. I want to remind you, we are trying to do an overview, so I would really encourage you, read along either before or after these studies, because what that'll do is if you've read ahead of time, then you'll go, oh yeah, I remember that. And if you haven't read ahead of time and you read afterwards, then you'll go, oh, okay, now I sort of see a more complete picture of what was going on there. At any rate, we are in 2 Kings. So open up your Bibles there. And we made it all the way through the chapter 10, though we were rushing a bit, admittedly, at the end, of 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 10. Now, chapter 10 is about Jehu. It's the last of the story about Jehu. He has been doing a really good job. He has taken over the northern kingdom. He has challenged the dynasty of Ahab successfully. He has killed all of Ahab's sons who were evil. And he has used his cunning, which is a nice way of saying it. It's deceptive. And we could talk about whether or not that was a good thing or not. But to kill all of the prophets of Baal. So remember the last major story about Jehu is he says, hey, you guys think that Ahab loved worshiping Baal? I really love Baal. Everybody come out. If you love Baal, you better be at this party. It's going to be great. And then he gets them stuck in there and he kills them all. So his goal is to wipe out Baal worship. And this, of course, we said, was the fulfillment of what God had promised to Elijah all the way back in 1 Kings. One of the major themes throughout the books of 1 and 2 Kings is God's faithfulness to his word. He fulfills those prophecies. And sometimes there's a prophecy and it's like the next chapter, it gets fulfilled. And then sometimes you've got to keep on going and keep on waiting, and there's all these ups and downs along the way. And one of the themes that we are tracking as we go is the faithfulness of God and the need, therefore, to be patient and trust Him, even when things are going up and down and seem crazy. Because, of course, that is pretty much our life, right? A lot of our life is spent waiting and trusting God to be faithful. And there's ups and downs, and there's glimmers of glory, and then there are just nasty, muddy pits that we fall into, and yet God is still working. So we see Jehu introducing hope in Israel. We also saw that Jehu, while he got a lot of things right, he's still not the king we've been waiting for. He's not the king we've been waiting for because he's not of the line of David, so we probably should have figured that out right away. But he's also not the king that we've been waiting for because he's not quite there, right? He eradicated, verse 28 of chapter 10, Baal out of Israel. However, as for the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin, these Jehu did not depart, even the golden calves that were at Bethel. So part of the downfall of the northern tribes in their kingdom starts right at the beginning of their story. Jeroboam, he introduces idolatry, worshiping calves, which again we think is really silly, but that's been a problem for the people of Israel since the Exodus. This has been coming up, and so he didn't totally deal with everything that needed to be dealt with. Now we switch over to chapter 11, and we are looking at Judah. Okay, so Jehu not only killed all the sons of Ahab, but he also killed the king of Judah. So there's no king in Judah. All right, so we read, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, that's who Jehu killed, saw that her son was dead, she rose and destroyed all the royal offspring. So you understand what that means? She is the mother of the reigning king, and her son is killed, so she then goes ahead and kills who? All the rest of her kids and grandkids. This is not a nice lady, okay? So she destroys all of the royal offspring, but there is Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons who were being put in the bedroom. Were being put to death and placed him in the bedroom. I skipped a line. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. So she hides him away. This aunt hides him away. By the way, Athaliah is the daughter of Jezebel, who married King Jehoram. And she doesn't have good intentions here, right? Obviously, her intentions are she wants to be on the throne. And so she will be for a time, for about 7 years. And she wants to destroy what God has promised. This is a major threat to the things that God has promised. Her name, ironically, means Yahweh is exalted. She didn't really live up to her name, but I say ironically because Yahweh will be exalted through her, will he not? And that, of course, is the irony of all of those who would defy Yahweh and God throughout the Bible. You will glorify God. You will, one way or the other. God will be glorified by judging you and showing off his justice, or by being merciful to you and showing off his grace. You can choose how you want God to be glorified, but he will be glorified. So there's this irony in her name. And then the Jehosheba, she is the daughter of King Joram, the sister of Ahaziah. Her name means Yahweh is an oath, or that Yahweh gives plenty. And so here she is really representing that God's promises are not going to fail. And so through her bravery, the line of David is preserved. And so he ends up being, Joash, as a baby, ends up being hidden in the house of the Lord for 6 years. That's a long time to hide a baby in the temple. That's what the house of the Lord is. And so right next to the royal palace, here is the true heir being raised in the temple. And all this time, this woman is reigning in Israel. But in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of hundreds and the Kerites. We don't really know who they are, just to be honest. You can read some different commentators. Most people think that they are some kind of mercenary soldiers that had been contracted. There is a group known by a similar name that were infamous pirates. And so some people have supposed that maybe these are actually people who were part of that group and have been contracted as guards by the Judeans, or maybe there's somebody totally different. It doesn't really impact the story, but that's one of those things that you read and you go, seems like we're supposed to know who these people are, and we don't. At any rate, the priest comes and he says, okay, it's time. And he basically gives instructions about how they are to make sure that the true king is protected. And he gives them spears and shields that had belonged to David and his men. It's a clear symbolic act. Presumably these warriors did not need different armor. They would have already had it. But he gives them armor that belonged to David and his men because this is the restoration of the legitimate Davidic dynasty to the throne. And so they have a coronation ceremony, and everybody is excited about this. This looks like revival. In verse 12, the priest brought the king's son out and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony. He gave him some copy of the laws that the people were supposed to be following. Now he's very little. He's 7 years old at this time. So that's how I knew that he was a baby, because when you read the last verse, Joash was 7 years old when he became king, and it's been 6 years. It's the 7th year, so he was just a real little guy when he was hidden away in the temple. But this is all looking really good, because this is the kind of priority that God's people need. And if you jump down to verse, and everybody's excited, long live the king, blowing of trumpets, except for Athaliah. She's not excited. She comes out, she cries treason, and the priest says, kill her and anybody that follows her, but don't make a mess in the temple, so kill her out there somewhere, and that's what they do. And then the priest, doesn't read quite like that, that's a summary, okay? Doesn't say anything about making a mess. It's really about protecting the holiness. I shouldn't belittle that. It's about protecting the holiness of the temple. And a covenant is made between the Lord and the king and the people. And what's the covenant about? This is verse 17. That they would be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. And so this is rededication for the people of Judah. We've gotten off track. Things have been really bad around here, but we are going to commit ourselves to follow the Lord. It sounds really good. And so we have Jehoash, and he reigns for a time beginning at 7 years. Can you imagine being king at 7 years old? That's pretty crazy. So we've taken care of 7-year-olds. They were not ready to be king over anything. But God, certainly, there must have been advisors involved in this process. God is in this process. And Jehoash is doing what's right in the sight of the Lord, basically. So again, we've had this buildup, and we're thinking, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the guy. And then we find out pretty quickly he's doing good, but he's not the guy. He's not the guy because in verse 2 of chapter 12, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. So he did really well as long as he had good instruction. Implication, maybe when that instruction wasn't there, he wasn't doing quite as well. The other issue in verse 2, this is said very clearly, the high places are not taken away. And so there is a change in the city, but outside of the city, there's still a lot of things going on that aren't really right. In addition to that, we then read about some trouble that happened. Jehoash says, hey, we need to rebuild the temple. And so he says to the priests, hey, go and collect money from everybody and let's get this done. The problem is they're going out and collecting money, but the work's not getting done. So there's a problem. It gets dealt with. The way to handle it is to give the money right to the construction workers. And the irony there, of course, is the construction workers apparently have more integrity than the priests did. Because once you start giving the money to the construction workers, the work gets done. And they don't actually even ask for any accounts from the construction workers. They're doing great. They're able to just trust them to do what they need to do. And the priests were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. I think it's an interesting story that's important in reminding us that we can honor God or dishonor God with whatever calling we have. Right? So here are the people, the priests, they have an apparently very high and important calling. And yet they're not honoring God because of the way that they're mishandling these funds. And then we have these guys who seem to have, a fairly average calling at least, right? They're construction workers. And yet they honor God in a great way, to the point where nobody even asks for an account. This is verse 15. Moreover, they did not require an accounting from the men on whose hand they gave the money to pay those who did the work, for they dealt faithfully. So, I mean, there's still a process, but the priests have been cut out of it, and these guys are doing what they are supposed to be doing. Understand that whatever it is that God calls you to do, if you do that faithfully, it brings honor and glory to God. Whether you're called to be the priest or whether you're called to be the stucco guy, you can honor God in that. And these guys did it well, and the priests in this story anyways, not so much. Now, during this time, in verse 17, Hazael, the king of Aram, went up and fought against Gath and captured it. And Hazael set his face to go to Jerusalem. And Jehoash, the king of Judah, took all the sacred things. This is where another place where we see things go, I think, wrong. He took all the things that Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah, his fathers, the kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own sacred things, and all the gold that was found among the treasuries of the house of the Lord and of the king's house, and sent them to Hazael, the king of Aram. And then he went away from Jerusalem. Now, I've already told you what I think, so that's not really fair. But what do you think of that? Was that a good way to handle the problem? Not so much. Anybody think it was a good way? Anybody want to be bold and say, yeah, I think that was a good idea? Yeah, why was it not a good idea?
First, you're taking all the stuff out of the temple that's there to honor God.
Okay, so it's God's stuff.
Not honoring God with it.
Yeah.
So that's a bad thing right there.
Yep. Okay, giving away God's stuff, probably not a good idea. Yeah, not relying on God to handle the problem. There's a sense in which Jehoash might tell us, like, hey, it worked. Okay, I got it done. I got this guy off of our back. It doesn't actually last. He's going to come back because paying people off really doesn't ever last. It's not a very effective way to deal with problems. But it's a lack of trust. A theme that we're going to see develop in the next couple of chapters is how God responds when his people cry out to him. And we're going to see that come out in a really big way when we get to Hezekiah, but I doubt we'll get to Hezekiah tonight. So that's probably where we're going to come up to. But it's this contrast between when God's people just go, okay, I've got a plan. This is how I deal with it. This is the political maneuvering. This is the cost or the price that I need to pay. And when God's people go to him in prayer. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy 17. 7:17. Sorry, 7:17. And I would like for somebody to read verses 17 to 24. Deuteronomy chapter 7. And then if somebody would read for us verses 17 to 24. Ginger, would you read that for us?
If you should say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid of them. You shall well remember that the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all of Egypt the great trials which your eyes saw, and the signs and the wonders and the mighty hand and the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God brought you out. So shall the Lord your God do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. Moreover, the Lord your God will send the hornet against them until those who are left and hide themselves from you perish. You shall not dread them, for the Lord your God is in your midst, a great and awesome God. The Lord your God will clear away these nations before you, little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them quickly, for the wild beasts would grow too numerous for you. But the Lord your God will deliver them before you and will throw them into great confusion until they are destroyed. He will deliver their kings into your hand, so that you will make their name perish from under heaven. No man will be able to stand before you until they have destroyed them, until you have destroyed them.
Okay. So this is Moses. He is giving his last sermon to the people of Israel. Deuteronomy is this big sermon, and this is about the conquest, right? To be fair, the conquest has already happened, but there's some principles here that would have benefited the kings to keep in mind, right? When Israel is going to take the land, God tells them, "You're going to see nations, and they are going to be bigger than you. They're going to be scary." And what are they supposed to do? What is Israel supposed to do?
Trust in God and go on.
Trust God and move forward. Yeah? There's a verb that I think is really important in verse 18. You shall not be afraid of them. Now, that's not the verb I'm honing in on yet. But first of all, those kinds of commands are hard, aren't they? Don't be afraid. Okay, like if I could do that, I would be happy to, but it's very hard to stop fear once it's entered into your mind. God gives them what they need to be focused on. Because that's always the challenge. Whenever you're trying to stop something that feels uncontrollable in your life, what you need to actually do is not focus on that thing, but focus on something else, right? Because if you focus on, I don't want to be afraid of the big scary monster, and you keep on thinking about the big scary monster that you don't want to be afraid of, it's not going to be an effective way to stop the fear, right? Because all you're thinking about is the big scary monster or the big scary nation or whatever it is. You need to shift your focus. And so God tells them to remember. That's the big thing that he tells them to do. Remember what I did. Remember what they did in the book of Joshua when they crossed the Jordan River? What were they supposed to do? So God stops the waters and he says, on your way through, pick up stones, pick up some rocks and build a big pile of rocks so that when you walk by here and your kids go, who made that big pile of rocks? And you go, well, that was your grandpa so-and-so, and this was when God did these things. There are, and we see monuments getting set up in the book of Genesis. There are these reminders that God says you need these to be reminded. That's the whole Deuteronomy, just a chapter earlier. Bind these words on your, on your arms, on your frontals, write them on your doorposts. Get some reminders in front of you about who God is and what he does and what he has done, so that when you focus on that, you're going to remember, okay, the Lord your God is in your midst, and he is a great and awesome God. He's the one who's going to clear the way. That's where your focus needs to be. That's a huge part of why God responds to prayer, right? Because prayer is getting your focus in the right place. So this is a shortcoming. I really think it is. And this shortcoming is going to become a pattern that we'll see also. God's people giving the stuff that they're supposed to give to God to the pagan nations and getting plundered by these pagan nations. It's going to happen a couple more times before we get to the end of the book of Kings. And so what's happened is, and this is what happens, I don't want to minimize anybody who struggles with fear, because I think in different circumstances we all struggle with fear of different things. So we just be honest about that. Not trying to say anybody does this perfectly, but what's happening when you're afraid is that the thing or the person that you are afraid of has functionally become God. It's become the biggest thing for you, because God is the real God, who is bigger, is out of the picture in your mind. And I'm not saying that if you are afraid of something that you are inherently guilty of idolatry. That's not what I'm trying to say. But functionally, the thing you're afraid of has become God for you. And because it's taken God's place as the biggest, mightiest thing in your world. And that's what's happened here. This nation, Aram and Hazael, have functionally become God. And in keeping with that, the king has given all the stuff that's supposed to be God's to this false god that he's afraid of. It's something really important, I think, for us to grasp there, because it's incredibly practical. To recognize that when we're afraid, what we're afraid of is actually standing in God's place. Because if it wasn't, we would be looking at that thing and saying, well, it's sort of big and scary, but my God is way up here. And so I actually don't need to be afraid. And that fear would fade away. I'm not saying that's easy. We need help. We need to be reminded. We need each other to help remind each other. We need encouragement. That this is why it's so important that we get together and get other people around us who point us to the one true God, because we have a tendency to not remember but forget. This is why you need to sing songs that remind you about the greatness of God, because they get stuck in your head and you hum them and you sing them all throughout the week. This is why you need to come to Bible study, because we talk about how great God is. And this is why you need to share prayer requests with each other, so that you can encourage one another to remember how great God is. And so part of the reason we gather and we do these things is not just to have novel ideas, right? I've talked to, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir on multiple levels. A lot of you are going to choir after this, and you're here, and that's good. But when you come to Bible study, it's not just about learning new stuff. I talked to a lot of people, not in our church, other churches. And they say, well, I'm not going to go to Bible study or Sunday school because I already learned all that stuff. It's not about learning new stuff. Now, hopefully you do learn some new stuff, but that's not the main point. The main point is keeping your focus where it needs to be. We need to be reminded of the stuff that we already know. I need to be reminded of the stuff that I already know. That's the main reason why we need to keep these patterns in our lives. Okay? Now, here's another neat connection to the whole Bible pattern. The scriptures tell of a day when the nations will not plunder God's house, but they will bring their riches to him. Right? So Isaiah, which we're shortly going there, Isaiah chapter 60 is all about the nations coming to worship in Zion. And bringing their riches, and they bring things like gold and frankincense you get a glimpse of this. I'm not saying this is the full-blown manifestation and fulfillment of Isaiah 60. Do you see how that connects to the start of Jesus' life? Who comes and brings gold and frankincense to Jesus? The Magi. They're not, as best we can tell, they're not Israelites. They are people who probably learned something about Israel from Israelites who were in Babylon when they were in exile. These are foreigners. These are wealthy men, not necessarily kings, even though we call them that in our songs, but wealthy, influential men bringing their riches to the true God who happens to have been born in a manger in Bethlehem. You see another glimpse, not the full fulfillment of it, in even Paul and his ministry. Remember what Paul's doing? One of the themes that keeps coming up in his letters is he's taking up a collection for who? Jerusalem. He's going around to all these ex-pagans who've become Christians and saying, send your money to Jerusalem to help God's people there. And this really all plays out in the book of Revelation, right? When one day every knee will bow. And in accordance with Isaiah 60, the nations will either come to Christ to be healed or they will be crushed. And this pattern that we see in 2 Kings will stop. And it stops with the true king, who is Jesus. And we get glimpses of it. And of course, we'll see it fully at the end of time. Okay. So there's this glimmer of hope, but it's not quite there in chapter 12. And then we shift back to Israel in chapter 13. And in chapter 13, 2 Kings. We're in 2 Kings, now looking at chapter 13. In the 23rd year of Joash, sometimes Jehoash, that's one of the ones that gets spelt differently, even in the same book. Not totally important, because we know who is the ultimate author of the scriptures. Yep, that's right. Yep, very good math. 30. So he's 30. The book of Kings seems to have been compiled from multiple sources. And so somebody went through and they said, oh, hey, here's all the different records we have. But God's in all that. But that's probably the reason why there's different spellings of names. So we have Joash and Jehoash, and we go, well, which one is it? Well, some people probably wrote it one way, some people wrote it another way. Can you imagine a world that did not have dictionaries and the same kind of strict spelling rules? What would your grammar teacher do? I mean, who knows? But that is the way it was in the ancient world. So it was okay to have different spellings of names. That was not a big deal. That was not a problem for them. It throws us off, though, especially when we can hardly pronounce the names anyways, and then they go and, we change it up a little bit. So Joash, the son of Haziah, the king of Judah, Jehoaz, the son of Jehu, became king over Israel at Samaria. And he reigned for 17 years. But what do we read? The revival in Israel doesn't last very long. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he followed the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, with which he made Israel sin, and he did not turn from them. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them continually into the hand of Hazael, the king of Aram, and into the hand of Benhadad, the son of Hazael. Then, okay, well, let's just pause there. One of the things that drives God's people a little crazy in the Old Testament is that God uses wicked nations to judge them. And they don't like that. These nations are not nice nations. Hazael's not a nice guy. Elisha told him, I see all the bad things you're going to do. You're not a nice man. And yet God is going to use you, and he's going to allow this. It is a testimony to God's sovereignty that makes us uncomfortable. God is in control, and he will sometimes use a wicked nation to judge his people, and then he will judge that nation for their wickedness, including the harshness with which they judged his own people. And you read that in Isaiah chapter 10. Habakkuk, one of probably, well, I'm not sure if we should have favorites. It's like having a favorite child. I don't think you're supposed to do that. But if I had to choose a favorite book, maybe the whole Bible, definitely for the whole Old Testament, Habakkuk is my favorite. And so we'll get there someday. But Habakkuk, that's the big complaint. Like, hey, wait a minute. You know, I know we've been bad, but these guys are really bad. How are you going to use them? God's at work. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. You know what? I think it's Jeremiah 20. I could be wrong, but it's right in that range. It's the whole potter's freedom and then the remnant. That's
Right.
reoccurring.
Yep, that's a recurring theme in Jeremiah. You know, God's the potter. One of the strongest statements about God's sovereignty comes in Romans chapter 9, and that gets referenced there. And basically, you know, who are you, the clay, to talk back to the potter? That's a hard pill to swallow, and yet God is sovereign in that. How is it comforting that God is sovereign in that? How's it comforting to know, even as God's people are getting punished, that God is sovereign in that?
Because God is in control.
God's in control.
And we know that God is good.
Okay, He's fair. There's mercy mixed in with that. Yeah, I think it's important to know that even when it looks like evil's winning, God is still in control of that, and that sometimes God. And yet, there is something, if we can zoom out a little bit and get past the initial jarring reaction that we have to that, we can see that this is actually very comforting. Even as it looks like evil's winning, evil's not winning, because that's just God doing what God does. And He's in total control. He's in total control here. Because Jehoaz, now remember, Jehoaz is not a real good guy. We're told he's not a good guy. That's what we just read. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He entreated the favor of the Lord, and the Lord listened to him. And he saw the oppression and how King Aram oppressed them, and the Lord gave Israel a deliverer. We don't know who that was. So that they escaped from under the hand of the Arameans. And the sons of Israel lived in their tents formerly, and it goes on and tells us a little bit what that was like. So God's in control, which also means that God can respond and He can change that situation on a dime. And as He's growing His people and saying, you need to learn to turn to me and trust me, He can respond and He can change that. He cares. So God is not indifferent, even when He allows and even when He is behind a disciplinary action that causes pain to His people. He is not indifferent to their suffering. That's also really important. Because if we say, well, God is sovereign, God's in control of everything, and God is letting me go through hard stuff, it's very important for you to know that that does not mean, though you might think it would, does not mean that God is indifferent to that. Does not mean that God is just going, well, I planned this, and you just have to suck it up and get through it, and I don't really care if you feel bad. No, God is saying He cares about the pain, and He's not indifferent to the pain of His people, even when that pain is a part of His plan. And I'm not saying these are easy things to hold together, but if we can leave that just for what the Bible says, and then zoom back and go, okay, there is some comfort to be had there. All right? So we do see God and His control all throughout this. At any rate, unfortunately, Jehoash does not really turn from his ways. When we get the summary of his life, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, verse 11. He did not turn from all the sins Jeroboam. So any revival in his own personal life was fairly shortly lived. Elisha, we read about his death in verses 14 and following. And we have, so Jehoash now is king after Jehoaz. See why that chart's helpful? It gets pretty hard. If you've got this memorized, I'm just super impressed. I like the chart. Okay. And he takes over, and so sometimes called Joash, sometimes called Jehoash. Now this is in Israel, not the one from Judah. And he comes to Elisha, and he basically says, things are really bad. It's not gonna. You're about to die. He cries out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And what he seems to be saying is, we don't have enough chariots and we don't have enough horsemen. Like, we are not going to win any battles. And Elisha is basically going to tell him, you're focused on the wrong thing. And this is fitting. Elisha, we remember he told his servant, or prayed for his servant, that his eyes would be opened. And there's the chariots of fire and the horsemen. It's like God wins the battles. That's what he's trying to teach him. And he tells him, shoot an arrow out there. This is an arrow, the arrow of God's victory, and then he tells him, take another arrow and strike the ground, and the way you're striking the ground, that's the way you're going to be victorious, although he only does it 3 times, and Elisha's like, you should have kept going. So you're only going to have limited victory, but God is still at work. And then we get this really, I keep calling things interesting, I don't know what else to say. It's a fun story. Elisha died, that part's not fun. They buried him, and then bands of Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year. So it's like every spring, oh man, here come the Moabites again. And they were burying a man, and behold, they saw a marauding band, and so they just throw the guy into the grave of Elijah. Like, we don't have time to dig a new hole. We're just going to put him in here with Elisha. And when the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. Can you imagine being there for that story? Like, we didn't have time to dig your grave. Throw him in there. It's like, I hope he doesn't feel bad that we didn't have time to dig his grave. He shouldn't get mad. Now he's alive. Why do you think that story's there? It's like just a couple little verses.
Well, obviously it shows that God, he was the power all along,
Okay.
and not the prophet.
Yep.
The prophet was just the
Conduit.
Conduit.
Thank you so
Good
much
word.
for the word.
Yeah.
That was not coming out of my head.
You know, I know it's not the same as like the full resurrection, but I just thought that was really interesting. You know, the Jews didn't believe resurrection coming back, you know, from the dead. It's not this our full resurrection, but
Sure.
this is an account of someone coming back to life, and it's just puzzling for me how.
Right, to think about the Sadducees in the New Testament who
Yeah.
denied the resurrection.
Yeah.
And the way they did that, by the way, is they didn't believe in, they didn't hold all Jewish scripture on the same level. They only believed in the Torah, which is why Jesus says, you can actually get this from the Torah. And he talks about God being the God of the living. But yeah, good, interesting thought.
It's also an example of God using something unclean to do something miraculous, so God can use whatever he wants.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Praise word.
Right, shouldn't be getting any life out of that, and yet they do. Yep.
Well, as we have gone through all these acts of Elisha, it struck me that so many things that he did remotely. He just commanded it, and it happened
Oh,
at a
okay,
distance.
okay. That's interesting. So, and here he is, he's not really there, but his body's there. and
Yes.
He's still getting the job done. Yeah, pretty cool.
They're always looking down, going, "Hey, what are you throwing him on my boat
Right,
for?
right.
Hey, get out there."
Yeah, that's my spot. Yeah. That's an interesting, yeah, what the conversation in heaven was when this happened. Yeah, Catherine?
It shows how powerful God's anointing is. Because Paul would pass by somebody and his shadow can heal someone. That's a lot of power.
Yeah, yep. So power of God through his servants. is huge. The word that's used for cast here is also used, and we're going to see it when we get to chapter 17, when Israel is cast into exile. And so I think there might be a connection there too. The idea that, you know, it looks like, okay, we've hit death, that means we've hit the end. Like, just throw this guy over there, like it's over for him. We need to save our own skins because the Moabites are coming. And that is a common, and without the word of God, a reasonable conclusion to draw. Death is the end. And yet this little story is one of several reminders in the Old Testament that death is not the end. And it'll be an important thing for Israel to keep in mind when they go into exile, that they're being cast into exile. Their death, in so many ways, is not the end. Ezekiel 37, right? Go and speak to the dry bones, the valley of dry, dead bones, and they're going to come back to life. And then we get to the New Testament, and it becomes abundantly clear, if it wasn't clear before then, that death is not the end in ways that we couldn't even imagine, because Jesus is alive. So I think this is one of many stories that just point us to the fact that death's not the end. And you might think it is, but it's not. God's even bigger than that. And so that's a bit of hope that's going to be really important. Because things are going to, for Israel at this point, they're spiraling. It's not going to get any better for Israel. Judah's going to have a couple more high points before it spirals really bad for them. But it's going to look like it's all over. And it's going to look like God's promises have failed, and it's going to look like death has won. And this is just one little story that's just like, hey, just remember who we're dealing with here. Even the grave cannot contain, cannot deter, cannot stop God from his work. And so we're told in the next verse, verse 22, now Hazael, the king of Aram, had oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, and the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them and turned to them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and would not destroy them or cast them from his presence until now. So that conclusion is really important too. And the word casting again. They're not going to be cast, they will eventually be cast, but even then they're not going to die. But there's a reminder of God's faithfulness. Hazael is a reminder of God's faithfulness because God promised that was going to happen. So even the judgment is a reminder of God's faithfulness. But the preservation through judgment is a greater reminder of God's faithfulness because God doesn't fail and doesn't renege on his promises. He made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was a really long time ago. But because he made those promises, that influences what he's doing here in this story. And that continues to be the case. So, well, okay. I was thinking that we might make it to chapter 18. We made it to 14, so that's good. Okay, only 4 short. Yeah, that's, we're halfway. So, guys, if you have a chance, read up to chapter 18, and we'll definitely try and get at least that far next week. And my voice is about done.
It is.
Dan, do you mind praying for us? Thanks.
Heavenly Father, we put this time together, fellowship, and to learn your word. Just ask for your guidance and wisdom and strength. You take over the room tonight. Just thank your son for dying on the cross for us, Heavenly Father.